Judy Mitrani is a very good friend of mine, and Judy has her degrees from University of Florida and UC Berkeley and Caltech, and she is a director in the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute. She is also a director of the Disaster and Failure Studies program at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST. And she will give us a very interesting talk during the lunch, which, let me find it, Disaster Measurement Science, Reducing Loss of Life, Property and Community Functions. So without further delay, Judy, podium is yours. Please join me in welcoming Judy.
Thank you, Khalid. Thank you, Khalid, for that introduction, and also thank you to Peer for inviting me back for this talk. Like many before me, I've noticed, I too have a Berkeley connection, and I'm very proud to talk about it. But in addition to that, not many of you know, I have a very strong peer connection. And when Khalid invited me, I was trying to think, gosh, when was the last peer meeting I went to? And then I started thinking, what was the first peer meeting I went to? And I'm pretty sure it was the 2003 one in Palm Springs. So it was just wild to me that it's like coming full circle. And I put this slide up there, so this is what the SLC looked like a very long time ago. But more importantly, I put that up there for the students in the room. You're in a very special space right now. The colleagues that surround you are very unique. You're having engagements with all kinds of disciplines and seeing all kinds of wonderful talks from individuals, so take advantage of that. In your time in graduate school, take advantage that you have this, what did Khalid say, a 600 plus network of other students at peer institutions. Talk to them, engage them. These are going to be your collaborators, your colleagues for many, many years to come. So with that, I am very pleased to be here and very happy about what the topic of this annual meeting is as well. So it's looking to the future of performance-based natural hazards engineering. And I thought that a nice thing to do for all of you is to give you a little bit of history about the early days of peer, and then my personal connections to peer and performance-based design, how that influenced a lot of my work as a faculty member, and then how it continues to influence a lot of the work that I do at the government level. And so from my perspective, I see a huge way forward in terms of implications of performance-based design trickling into all kinds of disciplines and hazards. And so I hope you'll enjoy the journey that I'm going to take you on. So it was almost obligatory, I believe, to show this slide at every peer talk you gave many years ago. And so I just thought it'd be fun to come back and share it as well. But more, oops, sorry. It's thinking. There we go. More importantly, what I wanted to share about it is that it was a really nice modular framework to work off of. When I left the Peer Center and flew to the East Coast, I started implementing everything that I had learned within the earthquake engineering community into the wind engineering community. I was like, this is perfect. Why isn't the wind engineering community doing similar things like this, right? And so it seemed very obvious to me that a lot of the applications in terms of the hazard analysis, the structural analysis, damage and loss analysis is completely applicable to other kinds of hazards, and that you just needed someone to start translating a lot of these topics and methods. So from my perspective, I saw the whole thing as completely transferable, and was really happy that the state of Florida agreed with me. And so we ended up being able to get a lot of the kinds of work that I did in our dissertation into the Florida loss projection model, which is very cool. In addition to that, I think we were also fortunate that soon after the graduation from NSF in Pier, there was a big surgence of money, federal money, from FEMA to look at the next generation's performance-based earthquake engineering guidelines. So ATC 58, now known as FEMA P58, started really right at the end of that graduation. And that was actually perfect timing because so much of what had been developing, right, from the peer institutions ended up infiltrating into P58 and are still there in very strong ways. And so that's pretty exciting. So from my perspective, I'll go back just for a second to say I focus most of my work and energy in the early days and even now on the damage and loss assessment side of things. So just to give you a sense of where I thematically live. But so in doing that, when I graduated, I was asked to be lead consultant, downtime consultant for P58. And that was amazing because very rarely are people reading your dissertation, let alone trying to make it applicable to something that may one day be useful, right? Like a building code or future building code. So a lot of what we were developing in Pier in terms of downtime ended up in ATC 58, but almost in a very coded way, right? So a lot of the things that the researchers wanted, and I forget who said it earlier in the session, that we need to do more between academics and practitioners. It's true, because as academics, we want everything to end up in codes, and then practitioners come in and they're like, yeah, you're crazy, we can't do all of that. And so then there has to be this happy negotiating time, right? And so P58 for me was the first time that I got to see that negotiation in real time. What can we do to make a huge difference in terms of practicing engineers and bringing our science and our research to it? So there are a lot of things that are in P58, like length of time necessary to conduct repairs, the need to procure long lead time, so there's a flag for that in P58. And then was really happy, even though we didn't get like the full assessment, life safety assessments in P58, at least we got a flag for red tagging. Because in terms of downtime, if you're red tagged, that ends up adding a whole lot of extra time. So Mary Kamiri is not here today, I think, but really her work was truly inspirational. At the time, she referred to irrational and rational downtime, for those of you that remember, and I know a lot of folks had issues with the word irrational, but I embraced it. I understood what she meant. This idea that, there's a type of repair downtime that's related to repairs that's very rational, right? We have a lot of data from cost estimators and contractors and all kinds of folks that can tell us how long different repair efforts have taken them or their companies over time, right? And so we can mine that data and get a sense for what that would look like. But then there's what she would call rational time, and we later called it mobilization time in P58, which was there is this time between an event and the start of that repair that is almost like uncontrollable, right? There's a lot of things happening. There's inspections, there's trying to mobilize finances to do repairs, a lot of uncertainty, waiting for federal government to pay out and to provide assistance. So there's a lot going on, and that ends up adding a lot to the total downtime, right? And so we were able to keep a piece of that in there. And one of the things that one of her students had done that I was really appreciative for is that they had collected a ton of data of buildings that had been tagged post Loma Prieta and post Northridge. And then I used that data to get a sense for what is truly leading to these really long mobilization times. And I almost found that there was a really strong tie to tagging efforts. So it wasn't linear, but what I did find is that there was a big a big step function between a green tag, a yellow tag, and a red tag. And so being able to understand if your structure has a likelihood, what the likelihood of your structure being tagged in any one of those, you could at least start to get a proxy for what you should expect your mobilization times to be. And that was really helpful. And so that ended up having me get into this whole virtual inspector time frame. And I said, you know, we do so much up here in terms of damage assessment and structural analysis, and we have all the information possible of the damage inside and outside of the structure. Why couldn't we start to try to virtually safety tag structures? At least get a sense for what the likelihood of building stocks would be, how they might be safety tagged. And so I built something called the Virtual Inspector, which takes ATC 20 exactly and attaches it to the kinds of analyses that we were doing in peer at the time. And so what was really nice is that everything that's, you know, even though we had more information from our analysis, I would only use the external damage assessments for the rapid evaluation section. So what's the probability of being red tagged or green tagged after a rapid evaluation? And then do the same thing. Once you get into a detailed evaluation, looking at all of the information, or the same information that's in ATC 20, based from our analysis, to look at that safety tagging procedures. And so what this helped us do, right, is give us a proxy for that mobilization time, add on the repair time efforts, and then start to really compare the repair times overall for buildings after an earthquake. And that takes you to the end of like what I consider the early days of peer and my time in peer and my contributions there. But while this is really helpful, right, for certain building occupancies, all of those procedures that I just explained to you and that I'm a fan of and fond of because I worked on them for so long, they really don't suffice in capturing the loss of important services for certain types of structures. They're still limited in what they were able to provide. And so I still very strongly felt that we needed more models that include infrastructure failures outside the building. I believe that occupancy-specific models that incorporate human infrastructure was critical. Now, this is something that I know structural engineers, they might be as averse to that as Mary's Irrational time. But I strongly believe that if we don't understand how services are provided in buildings, that we completely miss the human aspect. And so that kind of took me on a new journey. And then I also very strongly believe that we needed systematic procedures for capturing building damage and loss of function over time. So at this point, I had gone on a couple of deployments in earthquakes around the world, and what I found was that, you know, we're all there to learn from the event, but we weren't doing it in a very systematic way. And that was very frustrating to me. And so one of the first things that I did was develop a structured survey instrument so that anyone going to visit a hospital post an earthquake could at least collect the same type of data that I was collecting, so we could actually start to, you know, look across events and start to learn from each other. And it did not require me to be out there in the field, but anyone with the same tool. So a lot of these things are actually being fixed thanks to NSF's funding with the Rapid Center and Design Safe as well. But now I'm going to get into the second phase, right? So this was really the kind of work that I did while I was at Johns Hopkins University. But it's when I had the realization. So I became very interested and engaged in looking at loss of building function. That it excited me the most because I found it to be the hardest, right? How do we actually define it? How do we characterize it? How do we model for it? And as a structural engineer, I had to swallow very hard to realize that so much is dependent on things other than the building, and in terms of functionality. And so that was a really important realization because, you know, as engineers, we believe that if we just design really good buildings, that everything should be fine. But as a disaster scientist, which I feel I've grown into, I know that that's not the case. And so this was really important. And so I ended up getting into a ton of work on hospital safety assessments and modeling. But one of the things that I learned from being a peer student is that as structural engineers, I can't tackle this in my mindset. I actually need to go and speak to physicians, and I need to go and speak to heads of hospitals. I need to understand how they characterize hospital functionality, right? And so it became very clear, and this is pretty consistent across the healthcare community, that they're thinking about patient surge all the time. Our hospitals in the United States run at like 90 to 95% capacity, so it only takes one major accident to surge your local hospital, right? So this idea that, you know, we have to wait for a major storm or a major earthquake to really cause this humongous stress on hospital functions is inaccurate. It takes very little to stress out our healthcare system. And so the way that hospitals and public health scientists think about managing patient surge is that they think about staff, stuff, and space. So staffing is really critical because only certain types of staff with certain types of licenses can provide certain types of services to patients, right? Stuff is like supplies, right? The kinds of supplies that are required in order to provide specific types of services. And space, this one of the three very important arms of this fault tree is the building, is the part that we all think about all the time, right? And so it's really the interaction and the failures of any one of these branches that could ultimately cause the failure of the service for the hospital. And so I had one student work on this, and this was really exciting. So we developed fault tree structures to look at failure on the human infrastructure side per hospital service, right? So a typical hospital provides upwards of 20 services. And so instead of looking at as the facility, is the facility functional? Is the facility that houses these 20-some services, are they functional? And at what percentage are they functional? And so moving away from building operable to not operable, but then really getting into the nitty-gritty of the services, I found extremely exciting. And now we're starting to, I started really to get into this whole functional recovery space. And so we interviewed a ton of hospitals and used that data to populate our fault tree analysis. And then we used our model to predict the failure of services of the Christchurch Hospital. We had deployed there twice. And we're looking at the entire actual Canterbury District Health Board system. And so what you see here is a resilience curve, right? But where the y-axis is functionality. And a lot of times, that's the question, right? So everyone loves to show the resilience curve, but then you ask the question, what do you mean by functionality? That's a really hard question to answer, and you're going to get very inconsistent answers. So we had to define what we meant by functionality. And we chose to define functionality how hospital managers would define functionality, and it's the functioning of the service areas that those buildings provide. And then we use our tool to try to predict, you know, given this type of damage and these type of losses and these types of agreements, what their probability or, you know, of returning functions to that hospital would be like. And so what you see here is predicted a simulated response curve and an empirical one. So we actually collected data over many years in Christchurch to look at the recovery of hospitals. And you'll notice one very important piece. We trajected the overall shape fairly well. It actually looks a lot like Michel Bruneau's exponential recovery curve, which was exciting. But there was this very big difference in our simulated and empirical curves. Any guesses what that difference is, why there's that difference? So we have a really hard time predicting heroic efforts. Human beings actually do amazing things in disasters, and our models just don't pick them up. You know, we don't have like a hero variable in most of our models, but the heroes are there, and they're doing all kinds of things to fill in when our infrastructure fails, to fill in when our staffing fails, to fill in all of these pieces. And so I'm fine that we couldn't get that drop exactly right, because what it meant was that in real life, a lot of people were doing a lot of wonderful things to get these services back up and running that we just couldn't capture in our model. But what that led to, all of that work, and it was exciting because we used all of those fall trees to train the state of Utah's public health department on thinking about how they would manage a post, earthquake scenario where you have very specific failures of your healthcare system. And so we actually used we used a scenario that they often used and said, okay, this is a scenario that you're all trained with. Let me go back to this one. This is a scenario you're all trained with. Now, you all fill out what you think the loss of a function for these services would be like. And once they did that, then we started integrating the dependencies across those services, because a lot of times it's not just the fact that you've lost a service, but now your service, say the operating ward would depend on radiology, right? And so what's the impact to operating if you don't have that? And so all of these interactions were really fun to do in a live exercise with the State Department. Okay, so that leads me to another student's work who was thinking about, so Pear's methodology gets to loss analysis, right? And now we were looking beyond that, right? So how do we get from our typical downtime estimates that are mostly dependent on repairs of the physical environment to thinking about all of these other aspects like supply chains and things like that for hospitals and integrating that into a design process, right? So she completed the circle with 2 extra pieces and said, okay, let's take all the fault tree analysis, do the functional loss assessment, and then in addition to that, look at what those recovery curves would look like. So we were fortunate to work with Arup on some real hospital designs at the time. We asked them if they would loan them to us so that we could run P58 and do a damage and loss analysis, and then kind of take over and put in our fault tree analysis and get a sense for what that loss of function would look like. So the first thing is, and this is something that structural engineers rarely care about, are where are these very specific services going to go in a building, right? So we typically care about the structure and how it's going to resist loading, but we don't ever think about, well, that part of the structure is going to displace in this way, and that part of the structure houses X, right? And so that X is super important to know. And so going through a hospital design and then also thinking about where are a lot of these services going to be housed makes a very big difference, right? So it's taking an important next step. And then now what she's done is take that and incorporate it into the design process. So if we were to extend the Pear methodology and look at all the damage and losses and then inject that into the fault tree, then you start to see what your failure of very specific services are in a very specific part of the building over time. And now you actually start to get these resilience curves for a specific building that houses very specific services. So this was really exciting, and I thought the way that we should be moving. But I'm always very self-critical, and so this is great. I thought the work was really exciting. I loved what we were doing, but it was still at the building level, and it's still for a single node. So you really wouldn't suffice in really capturing disaster impacts over a whole community. So how do we get there? And then that really kind of took me in a new direction on community resilience. But I really felt that we needed models that included interdependent critical lifelines and supply chains. We needed models that captured the network system of buildings that provide very specific services to a community. So understanding not just that that hospital is going to have that failure, but what's the collection, the aggregate of hospitals, what's the impact going to be on the healthcare delivery system? That's a really important question to ask. And that's the kind of question for a different stakeholder, right? So we're so used to, and this is what I was trained as a peer student, is that the peer methodology was to have the conversation with the building owner so that we can give them more information and have better building designs. But now we're talking about, well, maybe we need to be having this conversation not just with the building owner, but with those stakeholders or those managers of humongous assets, right? That's a very different strategy. And so I also very strongly believe that we need performance metrics that are relevant to the entire system and to these stakeholders managing those systems. So that led me into another very large project It was funded by NSF RIBS, then became CRISP, and then I think now no longer exists. But we did get funded in a really nice level to look at the resilience of critical infrastructure-based societal systems. And so this is a completely made-up term by me. So it's not a thing, but it's a thing for me. And I was trying to get my head around what it was that I was thinking as I was evolving into a very building-centric structural engineer, into thinking more about the community and disaster impacts and the inequities. I was really appreciated the statements earlier that exist when a disaster impacts a community. So here we are, right, as a single structure, and we want the best design for that structure. But what we really have, if we're thinking about a specific service to a community, whether it's education or governance or healthcare or sustenance, is that there's an aggregate of assets that contribute to that service area, right? So now instead of like the single hospital, think about a couple of hospitals and the warehouses that support that hospital and the clinics that are part of their system, and that, you know, so now you're starting to get the sense that it's not a distributed network as we would think about our distributed lifelines like here, right? But it's a virtual network that exists because these buildings are interconnected in a way that is together providing a very critical service to a community, right? So we have interdependencies across our actual distributed lifelines, but then all of those lifelines then also have interdependencies with this virtual network of buildings, right? So I had one of my PhD students look at the entire Canterbury District Health Board. I wanted her to look at all the public hospitals in the system, get a sense for how they were connected, how they were sharing resources, what kind of MOUs they have in place, how they were affected by the earthquake, all of that. And so this was now getting into, you know, what the network of hospitals looks like for Canterbury, right? So this is mostly public hospitals with 2 private hospitals. And what we found was that the Canterbury District Health Board was playing a very important role in integrating the services of all of these distributed nodes of healthcare delivery, right? And so, great. But what happens if we didn't have a Canterbury District Health Board? And a lot of times in the US, we don't have this kind of healthcare systems here, right? You can have like a Kaiser Permanente that has a big portfolio of healthcare facilities, but we don't have a socialized healthcare system, right? So we don't have the same kind of policies in place that this district health board had in place at the time. So what you'd see is a very disconnected network, right? So in one case, you have the Canterbury District Health Board playing a very important role in aggregating or connecting all of these distributed resources, right? That was like the dashed lines in my first plot. That's how all of these hospitals were being connected, was through this district health board. And if you took it away, it would become a very disconnected system. And then what happens if you have a disconnected system and then you have losses of nodes, right? Very important nodes. So in this case, I think it was the Christchurch Hospital and the Women's Hospital that we modeled as not being part of the system. And then what you have is our islands of healthcare delivery, and that's not what we want, right? And so the point is, of all of this, is that as engineers, we need to come to grips that when we're thinking about how our facilities serve society, they are connected in ways that we're not designing for or thinking about on the day-to-day, but they're very important in terms of the response and the recovery of all of these communities. And so kind of some more recent work, actually with Greg, and one of his students, Luis Seferino, was looking at not just the supply aspect, so you know how many hospitals are going to be functioning in a community after an event, but the demand. So actually doing some of the injury and mortality predictive modeling and overlaying that with the kind of models that I was talking about. So we did that for an example in Peru, and that was pretty exciting to try to look at it from both sides. And then finally, what I wanted, I'll end here because I really want to get into the NIST work, and I'm sure a lot of you are interested in that and opportunities that I'll share, is that if we start to think about all of these assets in an aggregated sense and how together they serve a community, then we could start to prioritize where we invest our retrofits. We will have some failures, but at least those failures can be controlled or optimized in a way that minimizes the losses of important services to a community. So just like I showed this example for hospitals, I had another student here, Shalay, she's now a professor at University of Florida. She was looking at it from a food distribution perspective, right? So if we took the entire food system for a city, we did this for the city of Baltimore actually, we could do exactly what I just showed you that we did for hospitals. We did it for assets and supply chains that are important and critical for the entire food cycle system. Okay, so we're making progress, but I still very much feel that we need a holistic approach to capture community functioning over time. We need models that interface multiple scales, building, institution, community, and we need to effectively use data that's collected over a wide range of timescales. So I really appreciated the conversation about the different types of data and how to manage all of that. Like now you're talking about we can maybe have access to all this data, but some of it's collected monthly, some of it's collected yearly, the timescales are really all over the place. And then finally, we need models that capture the complex interactions of so many community institutions. So I'm hopeful because we have SimCenter, we have our Center of Excellences in CORE, we have a lot of platforms that are tackling exactly these issues and will get us there. So I think the future is bright. But now I'm going to get into talking about my role at NIST and the kinds of things that I do there. So at least, I don't know how many of you feel this way, but when I was on your side, I thought NIST was like this big black box. I never understood what they did there, what it was, and it just seemed very foreign to me. And you know, we all know NIST for standardizing like our time and standardizing weights and doing all kinds of things, but I had never thought about it as a home for standardizing how we do disaster science. And so that actually was the attraction, by the way, on how I ended up there. And I'll give a small correction to Khalid. So just a little while ago, not when I sent you I think my bio, I changed from being the Director of Disaster and Failure Studies, which is all like the field work that we do for disasters is under that, to being the Associate Chief of my division. And this is what the division looks like. So we have 4 research areas, or 4 research groups. One is focused on infrastructure materials. We have 2 mostly on the structure side, 1 just structures and 1 earthquake structures, earthquake engineering. And then we have a 4th group on community resilience. And so that's how internally, the internal research that we do is broken up into these 4 thematic areas. But in addition to that, Ian, this goes back to the conversation we were having over lunch. You know, Congress gets whimsical and they love to give us extra things. And so we have a lot of what are called statutory programs. And these are programs that were created by law. Some staffer in Congress got some great idea in the middle of the night. NIST should do X. And then it got passed into law and now NIST does X. And so, of these statutory programs, I used to run one of them, the National Construction Safety Team Act, which is the equivalent of NTSB. So we investigate building failures, and the first investigation that we did was World Trade Center. We're right now doing another investigation, which I'll show you. And then we're the lead agency for NEHRP, the National Earthquake Hazard Reduction Program, and for NWRP, the National Windstorm Impact Reduction Program. And so now I oversee all of the statutory programs that are disaster related, which for me is pretty exciting because it brings me a bit home and focusing on earthquakes again. In addition to that, we have extramural programs. We have our Center of Excellence on Community Resilience that's headquartered at Colorado State University. We do a ton of work with them, and that's been really exciting for me and personally. And then in addition to that, we have a modest, I should say, grants program. It's called the Disaster Resilience Initiative. And so I'm sure you've all seen the RFP that comes out about every 2 years for that. All right, so I'm going to talk a bit about how we start integrating some of these programs to do pretty cool research at NIST. So the first one I'll talk is about our field studies and combining that with our Center of Excellence and doing a joint project together. So one advantage to working in the government over applying for grants and then doing that same research in academia is that I can propose to do a very long project, like a 5 or 10 year project, and hopefully, and maybe get someone to approve that. Where it'd be very hard, right, to write an NSF grant that would cover such a long span. And so one of the pieces, and we've heard a lot today about recovery and repair times and what that resilience curve looks like, but the truth is that it's it would be very challenging to get an NSF grant to support looking at the recovery of a community or community services over a 10-year period. And to be honest, that's how long it takes a lot of places to recover from a very disastrous event. And so this long-term investment in looking at the recovery of either a very specific service or a specific community would be very challenging to do, I would say, in usual funding streams, right? But we can do it at NIST, and so that's exciting, and so that's what we've done. And so I think I was there for 1 month, and Hurricane Matthew happened. I'm not smiling about Hurricane Matthew, but people say that there were no disasters, and then Judy came, and then now there's all these disasters, and NIST has to do all this stuff, but I promise I didn't bring the disasters with me. But so Hurricane Matthew hit North Carolina in October 2016, and we decided that we were going to start a longitudinal study together with our Center of Excellence partner. And what that meant was that we were going to go there with a very specific research objective, maintain that research objective, and track that community's recovery over a very long period of time. So we have now been there 3 times, or 3 consecutive years. We're just now planning our 4th deployment, and we don't plan to stop anytime soon. We're really extremely committed to continuing to visit this area. And these types of longitudinal studies are exactly what we need to start validating all of these models that we're creating that we think are estimating that beautiful resilience curve. We actually need empirical data to validate a lot of what we think is going to happen. And I mentioned, interconnecting community services and institutions. This is also really important. So we're looking at very different layers of this one community in Lumberton, North Carolina. We care about how the hazard impacted. So in this case, it was riverine flooding. We decided to look at school zones as our anchor for sampling households and businesses in this community because unlike the nearby counties, Lumberton was extremely affected in terms of school closures. They just closed for a lot longer and had much more impact to their schools than the neighboring areas. And we wanted to know, how does that affect a community when you can't send your kids to school? How does that affect your recovery overall? And then also we wanted to look at the business recovery and how all of that was interacting. And so this is Robeson County. Everything that's in blue is what got flooded. Everything is in red is the school zones that are the focus of our study, our longitudinal study. The green dots are our sampled households, and the blue dots are our business samples. And so one thing that became very important, I said this earlier, was standardizing how we do field work. So for 3 years, I directed the Disaster and Failure Studies program, and that became like my #1 goal, is that every single team that goes out into the field that has a NIST hard hat on better be collecting data in a very systematic way. It is not cool to go out there and just kind of follow your urges, right? Like, oh, that looks cool, let's go look at that. No, you're gonna go there, there's gonna be a purpose. This is just like an experiment that you would do in the lab. You will have a sample, you will look at buildings that are uninteresting, and you'll look at buildings that are interesting, and suck it up and just do it. And so that's what we've done, and it's important to do this, right? Because we might miss things as scientists if we don't develop a randomized sample before we go out into the field, right? And it is a really hard thing to do because we're trying to get out there in a very fast way. And we had to take a step back in order to do this in a very systematic way. The other piece was standardizing and training everyone that went out into the field so that they were collecting damage data in exactly the same way, right? So we're using empirical data to develop fragility functions, and we do not want to introduce any more uncertainty into that process than we have to. And so training became another very important objective for all of our teams that went out into the field. And so I strongly believe that this directly impacts any fragility function that would come out of work like this in the lab or outside of the lab. The other piece was standardizing social infrastructure data collection, right? So when I was a structural engineering graduate student, I didn't even know what an IRB was. I didn't know when I could speak to people, when I couldn't speak to people, but I cannot stress this enough. When you're interacting with humans in a disaster zone, there are ethical issues to think about and very strong ones. And so having training on how you do human subjects research is super important. And so just like we developed standardized damage survey instruments, we developed protocols for how we were going to query and question households about how they were impacted by Hurricane Matthew and then also how they're recovering from it in years after. And in doing that, so now for the city of San Francisco, it is really important. There's huge inequities in disasters, and we know it, but we don't always collect data in a way that highlights those inequities. And so we made it, I would say, front and center for us and the team that we sent to Lumberton. So this is an area that has about 30% people living under the poverty line. It's about 1/3 Black, 1/3 Native American, and 1/3 white. So very, unusual demographic in that it's split up in that way. And we said, how are these communities going to be impacted in terms of their recovery? And so what you see on the right-hand side is the probability of households dislocating, so leaving their homes post-Hurricane Matthew, conditioned on the same damage state. Now, as a structural engineer, you would say, well, clearly the damage is what's going to cause you to either stay or go, right? Whether you have to repair or not repair, that should be the fundamental reason, or item that we should look at in terms of predicting what population dislocation should look like. The truth is no. We collected damage in exactly the same way of every single household. We interviewed these households. And what we find is that impact and recovery are not affecting the community in a homogeneous way, right? So we have the non-Hispanic white, non-Hispanic Black, and American Indian communities being impacted in a very different way. And now there are many reasons for why that's happening, and we are studying all of those as well. But the point is that unless we're out there collecting this kind of data on the demographic side and on the physical built side, we never see these disparities as we see them here. So now I'll take you into another part of our NIST work, and that's our field studies, so very specifically the NCST, the National Construction Safety Team Act, and our another statutory program, NWRP. So after Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, we deployed a small team. We actually used a community resilience strategy to deploy that team and to look at data in the field. And from the information that came back, it became very clear that Puerto Rico would be an important region to do an investigation on. And so shortly after our team returned, the director of NIST opened an investigation, and investigations are different than just a research study. And so I use that word purposefully, right? So when I say investigation, it means that we have subpoena power, it means that we can coerce information, it means that we have to report to Congress on an annual basis on what we're seeing and how our investigation is going. So it has a very different level of scrutiny than almost anything else we do. In addition to that investigation, we're also doing a research study for things that fall outside of that authority. And so I'm going to go over the 7 projects that are under our investigation. And so the first one is Characterization of Hazards. So one of the things that happened in Puerto Rico is a lot of instrumentation that was measuring the wind loads and flood levels, they broke. They failed in the middle of the storm. And so we don't have accurate data of a lot of the loading that our built infrastructure felt, right? So one of the very most critical pieces is to get a much better sense for what the actual hazard characterization is related to Hurricane Maria. And I mean everything. So it's not just the wind loads, but it's looking at the rain, it's looking at landslides, it's looking at storm surge, it's looking at inland flooding. So it's really across all the hazards. We have 2 meteorologists working with us on this project, as well as 2 wind engineers and 2 earthquake engineers. So we have captured a lot of the expertise in terms of tackling this. We have already awarded, so I can tell you, there's some things I won't tell you because they're not awarded yet, but the ones that are I can. We've awarded a contract to the University of Florida to do wind tunnel testing, so it's at one of the NSF Near East sites. And we're soon to make we did the second award to ARA to do updated wind hazard mapping using our updated information that we are doing in the other project. Okay, so the second one is performance of critical buildings. There was a lot of damage post Hurricane Maria, and a lot of you saw it in the news, but our number one objective with our investigations is that we'd like to recommend, at the end of the investigation, changes to building codes and practice. And if we had looked at a lot of the housing stock, we would not know what the initial conditions were because there was so much informal construction on the island. And so it really kind of pushed us towards looking at critical buildings because most of those buildings were engineered. And so the focus of our study is on schools, hospitals, and shelters, where the majority of shelters are schools. And so that one has not yet been awarded, but will be soon. And we have several structural engineers and wind engineers working on this. And what we want to understand is what type of damage these buildings saw, and will be very dependent on the updated wind loads that we saw in the first project. And so a subsection or subselection of these buildings we will put in the wind tunnel at the University of Florida. So we're pretty excited about that as well. A third project, this is a social science project looking at qualitative methodologies. So this is a project that will focus on querying and interviewing households and those that provide emergency messaging during an event. So we want to understand how do households interpret scientific information that is coming at them, what are their trusted methods of getting that information, and what makes them take protective action versus not. So that's one aspect of it. And every one of our investigations has had a focus on communicating to the occupants how to take cover and how effective that was during the event. The other side of it is looking at the messaging that's going out and the frequency of it, the word content of it. So all of those kinds of things together are critical. A third aspect, which is going to get into a minute I'll talk about, is looking at the infrastructure that supports that communication. So all of the telecommunication network we are including in our study. The fourth project I'm leading, and this one is on morbidity and mortality. I allowed myself to be the sacrificial lamb, and it wasn't just because I didn't mind being at the crosshairs of anything that could end up being controversial, but it's because I was truly interested in this topic, actually because of my days of being a peer student. So one of the things that I did for peer is modeling fatalities in an earthquake, and I actually tried to find better data of morbidity and mortality to include in my models, and it just wasn't there, or wasn't there in a way that was useful to a structural engineer to include in an analysis. So really, when I took this project on, I'm not doing this alone. I have one physician, an epidemiologist, and another epidemiologist from the CDC leading the project with me. But why I took this is that if we make systematic how we do surveillance post any kind of disaster, we'll have much better data so that at some future point, all of you as risk engineers and earthquake engineers could have better data to do your mortality assessments with. And so right now, HAZUS does not include a mortality module where the earthquake HAZUS does. Oh, so HAZUS hurricanes does not include a mortality module. So what I'm hoping for is that the work that comes out of this will hopefully lead to better data collection and post-disaster surveillance of morbidity so that we could have better data to inform a future hurricane HAZUS module. And then let me add one piece here because this is something that's not super well understood. So a lot of us got a lot of information post Hurricane Maria about the mortality, and it was very confusing because all the numbers were all over the place and we weren't sure what exactly was the mortality rate. And the truth is that it depends on the methods. We didn't have systematic surveillance in Puerto Rico to give you a very accurate count, and that's the truth. But the reality is that everyone that has gone in afterwards, what they've done are statistical analysis on excess mortality. So they can give you approximations for what mortality was in the island for years prior Hurricane Maria and what it was after. And from that, they can predict this excess mortality. But again, they can't tell you an exact number or give you the injury mechanism, which is so important for the modeling. So our methodology that we're hoping to implement here, that we plan to implement here, is that we'll do verbal autopsies for the individuals that perished after the event. So we'll actually be interviewing their next of kin and trying to understand where and what they were doing at the time of their death. All right, the fifth project, sorry for, it's a very hard topic to talk about, but it's an important one. The fifth project is on the recovery of businesses and supply chains. So this is now getting into our NWERP studies. Everything I presented up until now is part of our investigation, and everything I'm presenting in the next 3 slides is part of our NWERP studies. So these are research projects. And everything here is looking at recovery. So we want not just, the investigation is very much looking at the impact post-Maria, and the study is looking at this long-term recovery. So similar to what we're doing in Lumberton, North Carolina, we're going to implement here. How are businesses recovering? How are supply chains recovering? What role did that have in impacting the ability to provide services for different people? We're also looking at the recovery of social functions, where the 2 social functions that are of prime interest are the education system and the healthcare system, right? So, okay, we understand from our first 4 projects what the impacts were to our physical and built environment. But now how did that affect the organizations? How did that affect the human beings that depend on that built environment? So that's where these projects come into play. And then the last piece is the recovery of infrastructure systems. So the reality is a lot of the functionality is hugely dependent on distributed lifelines. Lifelines is not under the authority of the NCST, so this is another way to study something that we think is extremely valuable for overall performance and functionality of services in these structures, but under a different authority. We have a ton of research going on at NIST right now, and it's exciting. A lot of it focused on disaster metrology and community resilience. I only presented 2. So I presented the Lumberton and Hurricane Maria, but we have a systems modeling effort going on right now for community resilience, metrics project trying to identify what are those optimal metrics to capture what it means to be a resilient community. We had an immediate occupancy project that was one of these whimsical things we got from Congress, and that's been completed, but it's led to another project called the Functional Recovery Project that came with the reauthorization of NIHRP. We have a project on fiber-reinforced polymers. You heard a lot about that today. After our deployment to Anchorage, Alaska, we started testing a lot of the retrofits or the materials used for retrofitting structures in Alaska. And what we found from our pull-out test is that there might be some deterioration in the materials depending on whether they're used indoors or outdoors. And so now we want to tried to figure out what's the level of degradation, and so we have a scientific project around that. The list goes on and on. We have a lot of really exciting work, and a lot of it focused on disasters. Now I'm going to get into the opportunities piece. I've been on the other side. I know what it's like to be a hungry faculty member and wanting to provide for your students. And so I'll tell you about as many opportunities as I can remember to tell you about. So the first one is come learn about what we do at NIST, what our research is like. So when we're not NSF, we don't just give out money to do work. We have a pretty modest grants program, but even those grants they're cooperatives. So the idea is that those grants are being given so that we can collaborate with academics and bring them into our research process at NIST as well. So one really phenomenal way to learn about the kind of research that is being done there is to come to our Disaster Resilience Symposium. It's every summer. It's at NIST. It's a pretty nice meeting. It's pretty small, maybe about the same size, maybe a little smaller than this. And all the talks that are given in that symposium are available online. The videos are posted within a month or two. So if you can't make it to NIST and you just want to learn about what's going on, that would be one great way to learn about it. So you'll see presentations from chiefs and directors of programs as well as grantees of our grants. We also have a lot of ongoing opportunities at NIST. We have a summer undergraduate research fellowship. Is Anne here? Yay! She was a SURF or no? Yeah? Or Pathways? Pathways, all right. I'll save it for the next one. All right, so we have a great summer program. Please send your students. I'd love to work with them. I'd like to find them a home at NIST. We have a wonderful Pathways program, and was a recipient of one of these, and this goes from high school to postgrad. So it's really a phenomenal way to work at NIST and have the government pay for your education. We also have a NIST NRC postdoc program. I've gotten my first NRC postdoc this year, and it's just been really phenomenal. It's a really competitive application process, and it's an honor to be awarded one of these. And so there are very few of the NRC postdocs running around NIST, but it's awesome. It's a really great program, and I hope that you'll send some of your graduating PhD students to apply for it. We also have a prep program, and that's a collaboration with the University of Maryland, with Johns Hopkins, and a handful of other universities. So if you're graduating and are interested in doing a postdoc in any one of those institutions, we could set up a prep affiliation with NIST. We have the opportunity to do guest researching, which is a non-funded opportunity, but I still think a really important one, and sabbaticals. Those faculty members that are looking to do a sabbatical, want to come to DC for a short period of time, you should reach out to your friends at NIST, because it's a pretty nice home for that as well. I do note that some of these programs are just for US citizens, but I noted it here so that you know which ones are and which ones aren't. And then to give you very specific opportunities happening at NIST right now, my last slide, that I promise, is we will have some opportunities in the coming year for systems modeling, preferably PhD in this area, for social science research, preferably someone that is trained in qualitative methods. And then we also will be looking for a new group leader for our earthquake engineering research group, and someone to replace me as Director of Disaster and Failure Studies. So that is it. Thank you very much.